Today on Zestology, we talk in general terms about immunity, breathing techniques, supplements and tips. Then we go in depth. Have you got mold in your house? Have you got it under your shed? I think I might. Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality and motivation. Welcome back to Zestology. Tony Whiten here. I feel like I'm in a bit of a netherworld at the moment. It almost feels like I'm on lockdown again. And the reason is we've got a very important party coming up in a couple of weeks, even sooner than that. It's a sort of like wedding part 2, like a reception. And you've sort of got to be at your own wedding reception. Therefore, don't really need to catch COVID over the next couple of weeks and sort of really isolating at the moment. And it brings back how hard lockdown was. And I've got friends in Australia at the moment who are locked down, and I sympathise with them very much, and everyone else who's listening to this, who's having a tough time of it, because it's just not right. It's not right isolating and not seeing your community and your friends. And it's on a day like today when you might even be able to hear the rain outside. It's pretty challenging. But there you go. It's only for a week or two. And then we'll be having one of the days of our lives or the nights of our lives. So that'd be great. And it's worth doing for that, isn't it? Now, before we get onto today's podcast with Beth O'Hara, something that a lot of people who listen to this podcast like to do, and a lot of biohackers like to do, is intermittent fast. And I've been reading a very old book about an esteemed doctor who lived in the 18th century. He lived from 1736 till 1802, and he was called Dr. George Fordyce. And he wrote a book about digestion and food. And it's all about intermittent fasting. He wrote, well, I wouldn't say it's a book exactly. It's a sort of a piece. And it's called A Treatise on the Digestion... Treatise? Probably got that wrong. On the digestion of food. I'm going to read you a little bit from this book I've been reading about Dr. Fordyce, because he had one good meal a day. That's all he had. And he was a famous anatomist and chemical lecturer, and he dined every day at 4 o'clock. So this is what I've been reading, because I've got a feeling that you will be inspired by Dr. Fordyce's intermittent fasting, though it might be quite different to what you do, being a listener to Zestology. Dr. Fordyce dined every day at Dolly's Chop House. His researches led him to conclude that man eats oftener than nature requires, one meal a day being sufficient. That's Tony just coming in here. That's just shows that Dr. Fordyce was ahead of his time, doesn't it? Right, back to Dr. Fordyce. He made the experiment on himself, and finding it successful, he continued the following regimen for more than 20 years. At 4 o'clock, his accustomed dinner hour, he entered Dolly's Chop House and took his seat at a table always reserved for him, on which were instantly placed a silver tankard full of strong ale, a bottle of port wine, and a measure containing a quarter of a pint of brandy. That's Tony just coming in here again. A quarter of a pint of brandy. That's quite a lot. Back to Dr. Fordyce. The moment the waiter announced him, the cook put 1.5 pounds of rump steak on the gridiron, and on the table something else, to serve until the steak was ready. This delicacy was sometimes half a chicken, sometimes a plate of fish. When he'd eaten this, he took a glass of brandy and then proceeded to devour his steak. We say devour because he always ate as rapidly as if eating for a wager. When he'd finished his meat, he took the remainder of his brandy, having during his dinner drunk the tankard of ale and afterwards the bottle of port. The doctor then adjourned to the coffee house and stayed while he sipped a glass of brandy and water. It was then his habit to take another. He made no other meal till his return next day at 4 o'clock to Dolly's. So Dr. Fordyce, the first intermittent faster, but with a little bit more port brandy, a quarter of a pint of brandy and beer than perhaps many intermittent fasters today. Today's podcast guest is Beth O'Hara. We talk in general terms about immunity, breathing techniques, supplements and tips, and then we go a bit more in depth about allergies, histamine intolerance. You probably know about my interest in histamine issues, and mold under the shed and in your house. But we start by realising we've both been reading the same book. James Nestor, Breath. I've been sort of banging on about it a bit. It's an incredible book, and it's one of those books that sort of, it's leapt over from the health space to the mainstream, hasn't it? It's done so well.
Yeah. So one of my clients was telling me about it a couple of months ago, and then another client told me, and another client told me. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, but before I got into naturopathy, I was a yoga therapist, like on the kind of a medical yoga therapist. And
Right.
I did extensive amount of breath work, but that's one of those things where there's always more angles and layers and deeper to go. It seems like your breath is so simple, and yet it's quite incredible in terms of settling our nervous system and our immune system.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And actually, I thought that when I started the book, I thought, come on, how hard can it be? There's so many.
Right. But most of us were really dysregulated in our breathing. I even noticed with my clients that most people, their diaphragm is locked. We breathe into the upper chest.
Yeah.
And then that's going to stimulate that. We think about sympathetic response that will keep us triggered, and it'll keep our mast cells producing histamine and so on. So even just learning to slow down and release the breath is a huge healing component.
Well, I've actually been talking about it on my podcast a little bit already, so apologies to anyone who's heard me bang on about this already, but I've noticed the histamine symptoms go just hugely better because of this, because of the one thing that I read in the book about mouth taping. And I was a bit nervous about it, but I'm sleeping much longer and deeper at night, and my nose is much clearer. I mean, I normally get quite a stuffed up nose at night, and I'm just not getting that at all now in mouth taping.
Yes,
Yeah.
my orthodontist actually got me into, so I have a sleep orthodontist who's worked with me, and he got me into mouth taping about 3 years ago. And it took me a good 2 months to acclimate. I had to put it on for a minute and take it off because I have a little claustrophobia. But I eased into it, and now I can't fall asleep if I don't. My poor husband, I look kind of weird at night, but it works really well. And one of the cool things is that when you're breathing through your nose, you produce more nitric oxide, which is really good for cardiovascular health, but is also mast cell stabilizing.
Mm.
And there's this whole immune calming component through breathing through our noses as well.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do notice a massive difference at night. I have to say, I haven't really noticed much of a difference during the day. I don't sort of feel like it's having a profound effect on my sort of histamine or mast cell levels during the day, but I am obviously sleeping very well. So, and going to the loo less in the night as well, which is another massive thing, which James Nestor does say would happen in the book as well. So,
yeah, well, histamine is going to aggravate the bladder. And I find a lot of times people get out between about 2 and 4 a.m. And that's where we have highest histamine levels in our bloodstream, where our bodies are processing that histamine. And so it'll get processed and aggravate the bladder and wake us up. And histamine is so involved in sleep-wake cycles as well. So it makes a lot of sense that that's improving.
yeah, it's a massive difference. And like you, I did feel a bit sort of claustrophobic when you first put the tape on the mouth, and I resisted it for a while, but Faith, my other half, has been doing it, so I thought, well, I'll give it a go as well, and straight away felt better. And yes, I went to stay with a friend the other day, and I realized, I don't have my tape with me, and I didn't sleep as well. So I think it's definitely a change for keeps, and a lot of the changes I try aren't for keeps, but I think this is one. It's I didn't think I slept with my mouth open though.
I think a lot of people do, and we don't realize it. I didn't realize how much my mouth was open at night. But talking about breathing, did I tell you about having a severe asthma attack where it was an emergency room kind of grade? This was several years ago, and I used my breath to get out of it.
No.
So we had gone to a hotel, and I had a lot of asthma as a child, and it had gotten so much better. And it actually stopped when I started doing the yogic breathing practices and working on breathing through my nose. And my yoga stopped. I've been off inhalers for years. I hadn't taken any Singulair for years. And then we had gone into a hotel. We were on vacation, and the hotel, I could smell the cleaning chemicals, and I didn't think anything about it. And we put our luggage down, but I noticed my chest was a little tight. We went out and we went to get some food, and we came back. And when I came in that second exposure, I went into just full blown, my chest just closed up completely. I could not get a breath. I could barely walk. I was just, my breathing was so labored. And I got up to the front desk, and I kind of was trying to get words out through these gasps of breath and telling them, I don't know what's going on, but I can't breathe. And she said, we just shampooed the carpets. And so when you shampoo carpets, you get mold growth. And this is one of the things I tell my clients is don't wet shampoo your carpets, because the water seeps down to the pad, and then you never get the pad dry. I mean, you do get it dry, but it takes about a week. And if you have water more than 48 hours, you have mold. So this is one of the reasons hotels are notorious for mold. So just all those chemicals and the mold spores and the mold toxins really got me. And I had gone up to ask if they had any other rooms. And that's where she said, we just shampooed the entire hotel. There's nothing that hasn't been shampooed. So I went out to the car, and my husband's trying to figure out where we're going to go, get them to place us in another hotel, this whole rigmarole.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there in the car going, am I going to have to go to the emergency room? Like, this is not settling down. And I, was waiting for him, trying to figure out what I was going to do. And one of the things I had been learning was called resonant breathing. And it's where you match the inhale and the exhale, and you just count to 5, inhale, count to 5, exhale. So I had that, and I had some eucalyptus oil. I didn't have a rescue inhaler. I didn't carry one anymore. And I didn't want to go to the ER. No, I want to encourage people, if you're in an emergency, please go to the ER. Don't do this unless you feel really confident that this is going to work for you. But I know my body well enough that I know if I hit a point that I'm not going to calm it down, I've got to go. And I just started doing that breathing, inhaling and exhaling to a count of 5. And I had eucalyptus oil, and I inhaled some of that to help open. It took about 30 minutes, but that asthma attack completely settled and went away.
Wow.
And I was tired, but that was just the power of the breath. And I can even notice if I start to settle my breathing. Did that pick up on the microphone?
It did, but don't worry, it's fine.
Okay.
Well, it sounded very interesting. It sounded like a fax machine or something.
So I coming in.
No problem.
So I noticed when I'm flared, my hands swell up. This is something I talk about in that nervous system reboot course.
Yeah.
The Mast nervous system reboot. Then if I start just settling my breath and breathing slower and slower and more calmly, and I calm my body down and calm my mind down, I can see the swelling my fingers go down within about 3-4 minutes.
Wow.
It's so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, one of the things that I'm reading at the moment in the book is about the Indian yogi who has trained in the art of Tummo, Tummo, which is basically sort of like breath of fire. And he's so good at it that he can direct it at different parts of his body. And they do a load of tests on him. And at one point, his left hand is 12 degrees hotter than his right hand. And I often get very cold feet, especially at night. I don't know if that's a symptom of histamine intolerance or not. Do you think it is?
It is that lower blood pressure, having trouble getting getting
Right.
the circulation to the extremities.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've been playing around with trying to send the prana or the chi down to different parts of the body, which is, I'm not quite as good as him at the moment, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, I need to work on that for my hands because I have trouble holding frozen things, getting
Do
stuff out of
you?
the freezer.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, one of the things I thought was quite interesting is I've been trying some of these breathing techniques in the book before bed, and I noticed that my heart rate variability early in the evening on the old Oura ring is higher just for the first part of the night. So it clearly works for the heart, as you say, as well.
Anytime we have immune dysregulation, we're talking about mast cell issues, we're talking about histamine issues, we have to always remember that the immune system is intertwined with the nervous system. There's not really a segregation there. And we often talk about, or if you study anatomy, like when I studied anatomy in my courses, there was a chapter on the immune system, there's a chapter on the nervous system, but that's not what it is in our bodies. And there are mast cells at every nerve ending.
Yeah.
And the mast cells have these receptors for the neurotransmitters and the neuropeptides coming from the nervous system. And then the nerve endings have receptors for the mast cell meat eaters like histamine and the cytokines and some of these other things. So there's this constant communication going. So our mast cells are really the interface between our nervous system, which is like, I think of it like the communication highway of our bodies through our whole bodies, and everything else that goes on. So if we want a really good entry into settling this down, we have to do the nervous system rewiring work. And particularly in the type of cultures we live in, and we think about just how stressful it is day to day. We've got traffic, we've got rush hour traffic, you have people cutting us off, we've got bills, we've got all kinds of political stuff going on. We're just bombarded every day. Most people have stressful jobs. They have something stressful in their home lives. And I tell my clients this is 50% of the healing process is we've got to rewire, particularly the vagal nerve and the limbic systems.
Yeah, and it's the hardest thing, isn't it? And especially the way our lives are heading, which is obviously a lot more people working from home a lot of the time, but constantly being slightly switched on. And it's very hard not to be switched on. And I think especially the events of the last year and a half, it's very interesting. What's happening in this country at the moment is at the time of recording, they're easing a lot of restrictions. And actually from the 19th of July, there's barely going to be any restrictions. And there are so many people who are still, and, very justifiably because they've been, reading all about coronavirus for the last year and a half. They don't want it to end. They want the restrictions to carry on. They are scared, and they're and I understand why they are. That's because they've been their nervous systems have been pushed into overdrive by reading all the news for the last year and a half. So it's a pretty challenging time, isn't it?
It's quite challenging, and it's hard to know because there's so much conflicting information, and where do you fall in things? It's a very confusing time for people. And I do nervous system assessments with all of my clients that come in. And the difference between what we've had the last year and a half versus what we were seeing 2 and 3 years ago, it's skyrocketed in terms of the amount of nervous system dysregulation, the stress scale ratings, much, much higher. So we need this more than ever.
Yeah. And technology has a role to play in that as well. Its tentacles extend into every area of our lives more each month, it feels like. And, I, for instance, used to love switching off for at least a couple of hours every single day. And now I find that quite hard because if you're in the car, for example, you kind of want to use your phone to be able to help you get to A to B with maps, for example. Well, I didn't used to do that. I used to just use my head and my brain. So I think that has a role to play as well, actually.
It does. And it's interesting because there are a lot of studies that how these electromagnetic fields also trigger mast cells.
Really?
And they trigger mast cell degranulation, particularly in the brain. So you think about people having more trouble sleeping after being on electronics, kids having more trouble sleeping, more anxiety and depression. And then another angle to this that I find really interesting is that there is a lot of good evidence right now that these electromagnetic fields actually increase mold growth in homes and in buildings, that mold species don't, we didn't evolve with all of this. So we have the natural electromagnetic fields from the earth, but the types of wavelengths that we're getting from electronics are things we've never been exposed to before historically. And mold species, when they feel threatened, so if you go try to kill them off or whatever's happening, if they're threatened, will produce more toxins and spores. And what we've got quite a good bit of evidence for, we need more studies here, but it's looking like mold species see these electromagnetic fields as threatening, as dangerous, and they're producing more spores and more mold toxins. And it's part of this explosion we've seen in terms of mast cell activation syndrome and the amount of mold that's triggering this and triggering histamine intolerance.
Wow. I had no idea about the potential link between EMFs and mold.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I find where people have their Wi-Fi routers will tend to have worse mold in those rooms. So we always have mold, right? There's always mold around. Anywhere you live on the planet, there's mold. There's been mold for as long as we've been here.
Yeah.
But it's growing faster. It's producing more toxins than it did even 20 years ago. And so I'm finding over time, people are coming in, they're sicker and sicker. And particularly in areas that have any level of humidity. I mean, I think about the UK, that's one of the hot spots that we see.
Is it?
And then all along the coastal US and in the Midwest, where I am, where it's quite humid.
Yeah.
About the only place we don't see people having serious levels of mold growth in their homes has been around New Mexico, Arizona, and the panhandle of Texas, where it's quite dry, more like desert conditions.
Yeah. We'll be back with the podcast in 1 second, but today's podcast partner is Magnesium Breakthrough by Bioptimizers. This is the magnesium product that I take, so I'm very pleased that it is my podcast partner on Zestology. It is the only organic, that's important to me, full spectrum magnesium supplement that includes 7 unique forms of magnesium. And really, I could wax lyrical on how great it is, but I think the best thing to do is just for you to try it. If you're having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, one of the best things you can possibly do is start getting enough magnesium. But please don't rush to the shop and buy the first magnesium supplement you can see, because most magnesium supplements only use the cheap stuff that firstly goes through you, and that's, I don't need to go into too many details there, but secondly, it doesn't really work. You don't absorb it properly. There are actually 7 unique forms of magnesium, and you must get all of them if you want to experience the calming, sleep-enhancing effect and the nice effects on your muscle as well. I definitely feel differently when I take magnesium, and that is why I take it every day. So you can go to magbreakthrough.com/zestology. It's a special page just there. Use the code Zestology to save 10% when you try Magnesium Breakthrough. That is magbreakthrough.com/zestology. You'll get your exclusive 10% discount. You get the chance to get more than $50 worth of supplements for free as well. And as I say, I could wax on as much as I like about this, but really, you're just going to have to try it. It is an excellent magnesium supplement, and that is why I use it and recommend it. If you're in the UK, go to bioptimizers.co.uk and use the same discount, Zestology10, wherever you are in the world. That's it. Back to the show. Well, I've got a bit of a case study for you, Beth. See what you think of this. We moved into our new place a couple of years ago, and one of the things we loved about this place is that it's got a shed at the bottom of the garden, which is basically like a sort of posh cabin that's like a home office. And obviously, we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, but it's been great to work in there. And we carpeted it and we did all the rest of it, and it's got a heater in winter. And I have found that, especially in winter, if I'm in there with the heater on, and I spend a few hours there, I sometimes feel absolutely dreadful on the day and the next day. And I can't work out why it is, apart from the fact I suspect there might be mold. Now, we know when we moved in, there were foxes living underneath, and we know it's sort of hollow underneath. And we managed to humanely get rid of the foxes and then sort of just put some wire on there so they can't get in. But I know there's a sort of a big trough underneath it. And I just wonder whether that is down to mold, because there's been these times that I've been working in there. I've come out with a splitting headache, and the next day I've had a huge histamine flare up, and I can't think what other reason has caused it apart from being in there. It might also be something to do with mold in the heater. So that's my second suspect.
What kind of heater is it?
It's an electric radiator.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there water radiation or just electric?
It's just an electric, sort of like an electric heater on the wall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it also one of the split units that does air conditioning as well?
No.
Okay.
No.
And so with this, you said you've got this hollow area underneath, and you have fairly wet winters there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the grass never gets dry between sort of November and January. It's just not the way it is in Britain. And so no doubt that underneath the shed, it's probably very damp under there for a few months. So maybe the heat is sort of heating up the damp and then all sort of seeping into the shed.
One of the things I see quite a bit are one of the problem spots in homes are crawl spaces. So this is where instead of having a basement or being built on a slab, there's the house is built a little bit on some risers. So you might have a couple feet, and then you have bare dirt underneath.
Yeah.
And frequently you'll get mold growth under there, especially if water is pooling at all.
That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. And then what happens is you always have airflow, no matter, you're going to seal as best as you can, but there'll be some airflow between the baseboards of the structure, in through the walls and through the outlets and things like that. So you get these mold toxins that are coming through. And oftentimes something like a mold plate test won't pick that up inside because the spores may not be getting through. And that's what a mold plate would detect. Okay. But if you put a mold plate in the crawl space, I have people check the crawl space to see. So there's all kinds of molds. There are non-toxic molds like cladosporium, microsporium. They're generally not a big deal unless somebody has a lot of mold allergy. And then there are toxic molds, and these are going to be Aspergillus, Penicillium, Alternaria, Fusarium, Mucor is a type. And these toxic molds are going to produce these types of toxins that will disrupt every system in our body. So our immune system, our hormone system, they're carcinogenic. I see a lot of people with atypical types of presentation. So they've been told, you seem to have atypical multiple sclerosis, or people who had unusual cancers early in life. But also just this mast cell activation issues that won't go away. And people are doing more and more, and they're taking out more foods. They're trying to whittle down, and people drive themselves crazy trying to find this exact trigger. And sometimes it's not what we're eating or what we're putting on topically, although, we want to be clean there. A lot of times it's what we're getting exposed to and what's happening when the humidity hits. Yeah. And then as far as your heater, so molds have a specific temperature level at which they grow the best and they thrive. And so what may be happening is you turn the heater on, then they're getting that warmth, and then they're starting to activate, they're replicating, and you've got that higher humidity. But here's the thing, Tony, anytime we have humidity over 50% for more than 48 hours, we'll have mold growth in that space.
Right. Yeah.
And that's hard to control. We bought a house here, and we had looked, where I live is along the Ohio River and quite humid because we're down in a valley.
Yeah.
And we had looked at over 50 homes, and I'm pretty sensitive to mold. And fortunately, and somewhat unfortunately, I start to react to it within about 2 minutes. So I knew within about 2 minutes, these houses we were looking at had mold and I have to go. And I was getting really sick looking at these houses. But we finally found one I wasn't sick in, I felt good in. Now, our winters are very dry here.
Yeah.
So this was January, and this home had no mold at all. And I tested it. We didn't show mold. So I was like, great, we're going to buy this house. And we snatched it up.
Yeah.
Well, then we tend to get the most moisture around March, April, and May. And we had record rains. And I started getting sicker and sicker and flaring and flushing, and my gut wasn't doing well. My brain fog, I just wasn't feeling right. And finally I thought, I'm going to retest for mold in the house. We had huge levels of aspergillus. So we had spore counts of 28 on a plate, and if you have 2 or more aspergillus counts on a plate, that's too much. That's toxic.
Wow.
So we're talking 14 times what we should have been.
And when you say mold plates, I heard you mention that earlier. Is that tell me how you test?
So what I do is have people do a combination of these just old-fashioned agar mold plates. They're fairly inexpensive, but here's the key. They have to be sent to a good laboratory to analyze the species, because it's going to grow bacteria. It's going to grow those soil-based molds you track in on your shoes, like cladosporium, that generally aren't a problem. You have to know what you have, and then interpret it in that context.
Yeah.
And then we also do an ERMI test, and that's a dust cloth test where we're collecting some dust and looking at what's showing up there in that dust. And usually between the two of them, it's fairly sensitive. And I've actually found it work much better for people than mold inspectors, because mold inspectors are generally trained to look at what would fail a building inspection, but they're not looking at this kind of more health grade level where it's going to be triggering some of the types of issues sensitive people have, or like you might have, or I might have.
Yeah.
So that's why we do these home testing first to see, do we have a problem? And if we do, then we bring somebody in to check for moisture behind walls and things like that.
So you did these tests in March and they came up massive.
But because of where it was, we were able to remediate, we got it all cleaned up, and we have to really control the humidity. So we put in dehumidifiers so we can keep it below 50%.
Yeah.
But I'm still detoxing mold from my body. I've been detoxing for quite some time. And that has made such a massive change in my health. I mean, it was the biggest game changer.
How are you detoxing?
So it's a combination of using targeted binders based on the types of that mold toxins people have inside their bodies. So we can get these mold toxins in our bodies.
Yeah.
They come in when we breathe the air. They can come in through our skin. And they can come in if, let's say, you've got a plate of food sitting out for quite a while. Maybe you munch on it all day, or you've got your water sitting out in the air. Mold spores will drop onto that food, and so you can ingest it. And so different binders work better for different types of mold toxins. For example, charcoal is one that will really help with a type called ochratoxin. But charcoal does not work for gliotoxin, according to the research. So we have a matrix based on the research, which toxins are there. And you can find out what you have by urine testing. There's 2 really good companies that I use, Real Time Labs and Great Plains.
Yeah.
And you do a gentle provocation, like sweating, a little glutathione, bring it out of the tissues. Once we get binders on board, I like people to do some lymph supports, a little gentle liver supports. And then some people like me end up with it colonized in their body. So if it's colonized, you might have a lot of sinus symptoms, GI issues. If those are really showing up and they're not getting better with the binders, then it helps people to do some antifungals.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I've been trying a new supplement which could be used for detox and mold, and is also definitely used for histamine. And I've had incredible results with it. It's called Toxaprevent. Have you heard of it?
Yes, I know that very well.
Well, I think it's a bit of a game changer for me personally. I mean, it's a sort of zeolite. And I've tried zeolites before, and I didn't really find much benefit to it, to be quite honest. But this is quite different. I really feel good after taking it.
So it's a particular form, and I'm going to butcher the name, but I'm going to try.
Yeah.
It's called clintopilinate or something like that.
Yeah. Let me try. Is it clinimipolite? No, that's not right either. If anyone can say it, they should get in touch. We'll give them a prize.
Yes, and zeolite is particularly helpful for ochratoxin and another form called zearalenone.
Okay.
No, it will bind up those two, we know for sure based on the research literature. And I've worked with Dr. Joe Mather and Dr. Neil Nathan on mapping out these binders. So I had a minor role in there. Dr. Joe Mather did a big chunk of that, and Neil Nathan. And then we've also mapped out these phase 2 pathways, these detox pathways for the mycotoxins. But that form of zeolite, Toxaprevent's a really good brand. There's some other brands, binds histamine, but it also will bind metals. Okay. And so if somebody you have a really strong constitution, so you don't tend to have all these sensitivities and things like what we see at our clinic. So you can go right in there for that zeolite and usually be just fine.
Yeah. It's
one of the last binders I bring on board with my clients because we have such a sensitive population.
Right. Yeah.
Because it can also bind those metals, and pulling metals out of our body is very challenging. It's one of the harshest detoxes. So if people have metal issues, we usually make sure we get the mold detox first. Yeah. Then after that settled down, people can do the metal. But we do a lot of zeolite. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And I think that, it's their research around how much histamine comes out of the body with Toxaprevent is pretty special, actually. So I've been impressed by that for sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's been good.
Yeah. It's a great binder. It's a little harder to get a hold of here in the US, but I know in Europe, that's the major brand.
Yeah, it's good. I tried another zeolite in the past, and that was I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, I just found that one very dehydrating. And Cyto Detox was the brand.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I didn't find that one help, but this one does anyway. So I mean, I suppose they're all very different. I think some zeolites are used in pet food and even in sort of commercial detergents and stuff like that. So there's not all zeolites are created even, are they?
Research literature on animal feed, because it's such a major issue in the types of foods that are fed to farm animals, and particularly cows and pigs and chickens. There's frequently mold in dog and cat food. Yeah. Because it's not human grade. It's quite a problem. This is why our pets should actually have longer lifespans than they have. They're getting a huge amount of mold exposure.
Yeah. Well, we're going to bring this out in the week of your new program, which is coming out. Just before we get onto the last couple of questions, tell people what that program is going to be, because by the time they listen to this, it'll be out.
Oh, thank you so much, Tony. I'm really excited about this. So this is a course on how to do precision mold detoxification for people dealing with mast cell issues. And we get a number of people come in and they've been trying to detox on their own, or they're trying generic detox programs, and they're feeling worse and worse. And so what this is teaching people how to test for your mold in your body. We cover how to check your home. And then we cover, so once you find out which molds are in your body, and I encourage everyone to at least test themselves for mold. It's one of the most under-recognized and major root causes for all kinds of chronic conditions, mast cell issues, but also neurological issues, gut issues. It has been linked to most of the chronic illnesses, been linked to autoimmunity. And it's quite epidemic. We're not talking about this enough. So I encourage everyone to at least test, and there are no false positives. You can get kind of what you might call a false negative, in that if it's stuck in your tissues, you can't get it into the urine. You might not see the levels, but if it shows up, it's there. There's not a false positive, and that's been proven in terms of looking at control groups Does everybody have mold toxicity in their urine? No, they don't. And I'm going to talk about how to improve the results. So how to do a gentle provocation in a way that doesn't make people sicker, because we get a lot of very sensitive people. How do we improve what we're going to see on the testing results? And then how to step yourself through finding, okay, now here's the matrix. I've got these mold toxins and these binders that I want to get on board. What order do you do those in? How do you introduce them if you're really sensitive? And how do you introduce them if you have a stronger constitution like you, Tony? Yeah. Well, then how do you support the liver? How do you support the liver? How do you know if you need to do antifungals? How do you step through all that? Lots of troubleshooting. And we've got 2 levels. We've got a basic level for people who are just getting into this. And they just want the bare bones, tell me what to do and how to step through. And then we've got an advanced level. And that's where I'm going to go through all of the research literature. I'm going to go through case studies and then fine tuning for issues like salicylate intolerance, heme pathway issues, those kinds of things that can pop up and make it to where somebody's really struggling with the protocols. How do you fine tune and shift it for those?
Wow. And I guess in terms of my shed, it might be worth filling in that hole with concrete underneath it.
Well, that's one thing you can do. One of the other things that is generally most effective, depending on if you can get in there. The ideal would be if you've lined the underneath of that shed with 20 mil vapor barrier plastic.
Right.
So you want to go with the thicker so that something, an animal doesn't get in there and tear it. And you just fully seal it. And then you put something in there, some kind of fan system that's going to blow the air out of the shed so it's not blowing up into the space that you're working out of.
Yeah. All of that sounds potentially quite complex. I don't know how we'd get under the shed. So it might be the concrete option.
So the other option might be the concrete option. And then maybe what you do is put some kind of barrier under the carpet. Yeah. So you're not getting that flow. And then they make these insulating gaskets. They're just, it's some type of foam that you put behind if you have outlets, like electrical outlets.
Oh, yeah.
You put it behind the plate to reduce some of the airflow there.
Great.
So the big things when we have mold is you want to get rid of any water damaged material. Yeah. You have to completely remove that. Yeah. Replace that. You want to get rid of any moisture intrusion. So if you have leaks or you have high humidity, address the humidity. You might need to put a little dehumidifier in there.
Yeah, that's a good idea because I've noticed the roof holds a bit of mold in it as well. Not mold, sorry, but it just looks very damp when it gets wet. It doesn't seem to just sort of drain off very easily. I mean, we didn't put the shed in. It was already in there when we got here, so that would be something. A dehumidifier is a great idea.
So anything you can do to lower that humidity. And I get these little humidity gauges off of Amazon. And
look at that. That's great.
Yeah, they've got some that are pretty good quality, pretty reliable. I put these in every room in the house. Yeah. Because with the humidity in the bathroom is always higher than here at my desk. Then the third thing is
just on the humidity gauge, what do you want it to be below?
We want it to be below 50%.
Below 50. Okay.
Even when it's raining. If it's raining, we're getting a lot of moisture. We want to make sure it doesn't pop above that for more than 24 hours.
And by the way, I always, my classic histamine symptom of the last 25 years is getting hives on my hands and my feet in very, very humid weather. I mean, it's perfect. It's all linked, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If it's worse when it's humid. And when people tell me they feel worse when it rains and they get more mast cell symptoms when it rains, it always makes me curious. Yeah. Are they exposed to mold? And there were studies, I'm not making this stuff up. The EPA released a study with Berkeley National Lab that 48% of homes in North America have water damage to the extent that they can grow toxic mold. So 48%. Wow. That 30%, the EPA, this was the US government released it, 30% of school buildings had water damage with toxic mold. That was in the early 90s. It has not been restudied. Yeah. And then we're seeing that around, I want to say it's around 40%. I don't have the number in my head of commercial buildings have toxic mold. So we're talking stores, we're talking buildings where people work, public buildings where people, go in, for government buildings, all of this. Then if we're in a coastal region, really high humid region, those numbers go up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's really interesting talking to you about it all. Those little gauges sound great. I think that's a great effort, as well as the lining under carpets, getting rid of anything that might be holding the damp and holding humidity in there. And I guess opening a window, which is a lot easier to do in summer than in winter, really, isn't it?
Yeah, depending on what the humidity is, right? You don't want to open it. Because I was opening my window here because we're so humid in the summer. I was opening it just to crack it to hear the birds.
Yeah.
And I was getting too much humidity in. So I had to close it again. But here's the good news is that even though this takes some time and some effort, I have had people have just life-changing experiences. I had a little girl just this week. She's 5 years old. And I met with her on and off through the year. She was covered head to toe in hives and just scratching her skin till she bled. She was telling her mom, "Mommy, I don't want to live anymore. This is so awful." She was down to about 5 foods. And she was getting the hives. She was better when she was out of the house and then getting them worse again.
Right.
So I said, I really think there's mold there.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to look at it. This is hard to look at.
Yeah.
But they finally got in a mold inspector. I just kept insisting.
Yeah.
They did find mold. They got it cleaned up. And when I saw her this week, she was 90% better. They had added about 30 foods in 2 months. And it was just extraordinary. I've had people who are having 20 seizures a day in a wheelchair, unable to write a full sentence, to get better. And it's not always that serious either. Sometimes you catch it early and it's just where people are getting those GI issues, they're getting those hives.
Yeah.
They might be getting brain fog, they're not sleeping well, depression, anxiety. There's all kinds of ways it can present. But if it's there, we want to get it out because it is carcinogenic. And if it stays in there for decades, we're looking at serious health issues.
Yeah. I think even things like, it's not particularly attractive, but, cleaning the toilet properly. I bet that's one place where mold lives.
Mold can, you'll see it. It'll be, black. If it's growing in the toilet, it means the humidity is pretty high.
Right.
And there again, there are ways to clean our homes up. We have to work harder at it now because we've got more, we've got all this climate change happening, which means we're getting these heavier rains. We're in some areas, we're getting hurricanes, these types of things that are much worse. Flooding can be worse. We've got the Wi-Fi issue we talked about and how that's increasing the mold growth. And then we've been exposed to so many toxic chemicals, more chemicals now than the history of humanity. And our ability to detoxify is lower. Yeah. So what we might have been able to detoxify 50 years ago, we just can't get rid of. And health has been declining. So we have to work harder than our grandparents had to work at staying healthy. That said, I see amazing turnarounds for people. In my own story, just where I went from being bedridden and on a cane and I could barely walk and I couldn't function. I couldn't read a book. It was just a horrible existence. And I'm running this busy practice and running Mast 360. And I just went hiking in the woods this morning. And, I've got my life back. I still have maintenance to do, but this is a whole different world.
Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely brilliant. And that story, particularly about the 5-year-old, is just, it's shocking that she felt like that, but it's heartwarming to hear that you made such a difference. I've got two final questions, same two you've answered before. And that is, what is one book you'd recommend? I know you're reading James Nestor at the moment. And what is one tip for living with more energy?
So I am reading James Nestor. I would highly recommend, though, if anybody has a chronic health issues, to read Toxic by Neil Nathan. He's my close mentor. He's a just amazing practitioner. He's really put this together and worked in this area for 40 years. And so that lays out how this is all connected, why mold is connected with some of these other issues. The protocols have shifted some since that was published. But in terms of a big picture view, it's an amazing book and one I go back to again and again.
Fantastic. And
then for more energy, I'm going to have to go with making sure that we don't have mold toxins in our bodies. And here's why, because viruses and bacteria, they want our bodies to stay alive because that's how they replicate. And so they might weaken us. But molds decompose. If you think about how molds decompose in the woods, they decompose trees, they decompose vegetable matter, plant matter, dead animals. When they are inside of our bodies, they are producing chemicals that are decomposing our tissues. And that's why this is such a big issue. So I just really want to encourage people to look into it and at least get the testing at a minimum.
Yeah. Beth, please tell people where to go to get the mold course, which is now available as people listen to this.
Yes, thank you so much. It's at mastcell360.com/mold, MOLD -course, COURSE. And we've got a money back guarantee. So it's risk-free. If you try it, you don't like it, or it doesn't help you in any way, we don't want to keep people's money. So we will refund them. And it's really there to make sure that people don't have to live through the kind of health nightmares that I had to go through on my own. Yeah.
Oh, Beth, great to talk to you again. And I live in hope that we can collaborate on something at some point. And in the meantime, really enjoy doing these podcasts. So it's lovely to talk to you.
Oh, I always love it to talk with you too, Tony. I really appreciate you helping us get this information out there.
Oh, thanks, Beth. We'll speak again soon.
Thank you.
That is it for this week's podcast. Thank you to Beth. Thank you for listening as well. Just before I finish, I've been thinking about a midweek podcast for Zestology, and I'd love your opinion. I'm thinking that it's sort of going to be a highlights episode, 5 of my favourite minutes of a particular guest from the past, the likes of Dave Asprey, Ben Greenfield, Dan Harris, Esther Perel, Joe Wicks, Chris Ryan, Paul Saladino, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to work out what to call it. So if you've got any good suggestions, can you message me through the website, tonywrighton.com. The short list is, so this would be a Thursday podcast, not a Zestology podcast, but a mini podcast. The short list is Zest the Day or Slice. I quite like Slice. Oh, and the third one's Coffee Break. So one of those 3, Zest the Day, Slice or Coffee Break. What do you reckon? Love to hear from you. Before we go, today's podcast is brought to you by my podcast partners, Magnesium Breakthrough. Check out the impressive discounts on magbreakthrough.com/zestology. That is magbreakthrough.com/zestology. I use it every single day. I'm about to go and have my lunch after this, and I'll have one after lunch, and then I'll have one at night. I take sort of one before I go to sleep because I do think it helps with sleep as well. You can get up to 33% off on that page. And if you're in the UK, you can go to bioptimizers.co.uk and use the code Zestology10 for a chunk of change off as well. So it's magbreakthrough.com/zestology anywhere in the world, and then in the UK, bioptimizers.co.uk. That's it. Have a good one. I'll see you next week.